My name is Keneth Enwerem. I work with the Institute of Human Biology, Nigeria, and I'm going to be leading this session on logistic regression, a step-by-step walkthrough from data decision, understanding why and how. Okay, let's roll. So, what is logistic regression? So logistic regression is basically a statistical method that is used to model and analyze data sets. This peculiarity about logistic regression is that the outcome variable being analyzed is usually a binary one. So you're analyzing whether something is yes or no, or male or female, or in terms of disease outcomes, whether someone has a disease or not. So that is the peculiarity of logistic regression. So we're trying to use predictor variables to make a prediction as to whether people in a particular group are likely to have a disease or not have that disease. So they're using explanatory variables to predict the outcome variable. Okay. So what's logistic regression and why do we use it? So we have a problem. We want to predict a categorical outcome with two possibilities. Okay, so for example, we're predicting whether something is yes or no, or someone is sick or healthy, or someone is obese or not obese, or someone is diabetic or non-diabetic. So usually the outcome variable is usually a binary one. That is usually the problem that we have to solve. And then, why not use a linear regression rather? Linear regression usually predicts a continuous value like weight, viral load, etc. Whereas logistic regression predicts a binary categorical outcome, right? Like we mentioned earlier, either a yes or no, and can give. So using a linear regression to make a prediction for a binary outcome can give impossible predictions, and you have things like probability of outside of 0 to 1. So the solution is using a logistic regression, which predicts the probability of an observation belonging to a specific category. So essentially it squeezes the output between 0 and 1 using the special S or sigmoid-shaped curve of a logistic regression. Okay, so this is the sigmoid curve of a logistic regression, and we can see that we have a range of outcomes between 0 and 1, which means we're predicting the probability between 0 and 1, and we know that probability usually extends between 0 and 1. It cannot go beyond 1 because 1 is 100%. So all observations need to fall within this probability of 0 and 1. So the objective here is to visualize how logistic regression models probability. The goal is to predict the probability P of an event happening. So we're predicting, for example, using the case of diabetes, predicting the probability P of someone having diabetes or not having diabetes. And the challenge is that probabilities must be between 0 and 1. And then the magic bullet to attack this is using the logistic function. So it takes any input and transform it into a value between 0 and 1. And that is the advantage that logistic regression has. The last session there shows us the equation of a logistic regression. I mean, that's not what we're particular about now. Okay. So we're going to see practically how to engage in using logistic regression to solve our problems. And the best way to do this and understand it is usually to look at an example. So we're going to be using R programming to analyze a data set. This data set is called Pima Indians diabetes. It is available. It is in open source. So you can be able to get these data sets and replicate everything we're going to do here today. So we will share with you the script, and with that you can download the data sets and then replicate everything we will do. So the data set is called PIMA Indians diabetes, and it's basically a data set that has diabetes as a binary outcome variable. So either you're positive for diabetes or you're negative for diabetes. And then the same data set has some predictor or explanatory variables, including pregnant, number of times someone is pregnant, your blood glucose level, your diastolic blood pressure, your triceps skin fold thickness, insulin levels in the blood, your body mass index, and then your pedigree, whether you have um, a history of diabetes in your family or not, and finally, age. Okay, so the objective that we have here is to determine which of these predictor variables are associated with meaningful changes in the probability of being diagnosed with diabetes. And we'll go ahead to quantify the extent of the influence of these explanatory variables on the outcome variable, which is diabetes. So because of the time limitations of this session, we will restrict ourselves to using only two of the explanatory variables, which is glucose and age. Understanding how these predictors influence the probability of diabetes can inform risk stratification, policy, and clinical intervention. Okay, so I will switch my screen to R. So this entire script just will show us how we'll move step by step in the logistic regression process. So first of all, we will install and load the packages that we need. I mean, if you're working in R, you should already know the tidyverse package and the GT extras. The one that produces our data set is this ML bench. So that's where the data set PIMA Indians diabetes is from. Patchwork and Plotly I just used for visualization. So yeah. Okay, so this next code will read our data set. So I'm just going to run that to read our data set. And then you're going to view like the first 10 rows of our data set so that we can appreciate what our data set looks like, right? Okay, so this is the first 10 rows of our data set. So we can see the variables that are available in our data set. So pregnancy, glucose. So pregnancy, how many times the individual has been pregnant, glucose levels that the person has, the diastolic blood pressure, the triceps skin fold thickness, the insulin levels, the mass, the pedigree, and the age, and then the outcome variable, which is diabetes. So this tells us whether the person has diabetes or not. POS means positive, NEG means negative. So if you see green, it means that individual has diabetes, while the pink color shows that that individual does not have diabetes. So this is the data set we're using. So it has 768 observations and 9 variables. So this is the typical data set here. Okay, I just showed us the first 10 rows of that data set in the other script. Okay, so let's head on. So we want to look at the relationship between, so like I said, because of the time constraints of this session, we're going to be looking at only two explanatory variables, which are glucose and age. So, but first of all, let us see generally how glucose relates with diabetes, which is the outcome variable of interest here. So we're just going to visualize and see with a scatter plot the relationship of glucose and the diabetes in this particular data set. So I'm just going to run this so we see that. So here is just a scatter plot that is showing us. So the pink colored observations are those that have diabetes. The green colored observations are those that do not have diabetes. And then on the x-axis, which is the independent axis, shows us the increments in the glucose level within that population. So you can see glucose level varies from 0 up to 200. And then we'll have two categories, diabetes and non-diabetes. If you look closely, you will see that those that have diabetes are more aggregated on the higher part of the glucose level, whereas those without diabetes are more aggregated on the lower side of the glucose level. So we're already beginning to see from the visualizations that it's more likely, those that have diabetes are more likely to have a higher glucose level, or let me put it in the right way, those with higher glucose level are more likely to have diabetes. Let's look at this in a box plot so that we appreciate it better. So this is a box plot of the same data. So we can already begin to see the median value of glucose level for those without diabetes is just a little above 100, whereas the median value for those with diabetes is close to 150. So we can see this box plot is already giving us a more better picture of the relationship between glucose level and diabetes. Again, we can see the probability curve showing the relationship between glucose level and diabetes. So here we can already see that as glucose level is increasing, the probability of getting diabetes is also increasing. You can see that, this probability curve. Okay, so now let us deploy our logistic regression to understand the relationship between diabetes and glucose. So we're going to be using the generalized linear model function as this GLM in R to generate the regression model. So we will put in our outcome variable, which is diabetes, versus the experimental variable, which is glucose. And then our data set, which is the PIMA Indian diabetes. And then family binomial means we're dealing with logistic regression because we're dealing with binary outcome. So that's what this family binomial means. And then we will now run the summary function to give us a summary of this model. So I will just run this so that we can appreciate the values. So it chunks out a lot of values for us here. And we will take our time to look at some of these values, the important ones that really give us the information we need. Okay, so you can see the code that was used to generate the logistic regression model. And then we have our coefficients. So the coefficients it chunks out are, number one is the estimate, and then we'll have the standard error, the z-value, and then this, which is the p-value. Okay, so the two most important ones for us are the estimate and the p-value. The estimate tells us, it quantifies the relationship between diabetes and glucose, whereas the p-value tells us the level of significance that this estimate has. Okay, so what the first row in a logistic regression is usually like the baseline row. So this gives us the value or the estimate when glucose is 0. So, but I mean, glucose is never 0 in any human being. So this is not really considered. But where we have the good information is on this second row. And what this estimate stands for here, this 0.03, means that for each unit rise in glucose value, there is a 0.03 chance that the individual is diabetic. So that's what this 0.03 is telling us. I'm using chance here loosely. This value actually is the log of the odds, but the log of the odds is similar to the chance or the probability. So in order to use a term that is more general, I'll use chance, but the actual thing is the logarithm, the natural logarithm of the odds of this outcome variable. So for each unit rise in the glucose level, there is a 0.03 increase in the chance of having diabetes. So that is what this tells. And then the p-value here, which is 2 times 10 raised to the power minus 16, which is far less than 0.05, tells us that this estimate that we're seeing here is highly statistically significant. So those are the two important information from this, right? We have some other information here which we'll discuss a bit further, right? Okay, so again, this is just telling us the GLM function is the generalized linear model function, which is used to fit a logistic regression model. The formula diabetes and various glucose specifies that we are modeling diabetes as the outcome variable predicted by glucose, which is the explanatory variable. And then the family equal to binomial. That argument indicates that we're using logistic regression, which is appropriate for binary outcome. And finally, the summary function just provides a detailed result of the model, which is what we've seen here. Okay, so we've seen how the logistic regression is used to fit a model between glucose and diabetes. Okay, so the second thing we'll look at is now that was the explanatory variable in this initial case is a continuous variable, right? Glucose level is a continuous variable. So let's look at how we can fit a model where the explanatory variable is a categorical variable, right? So we're going to use age in this instance. However, the age in our data set, if we look at our data set, I've taken it out. The age in our data set is a numeric, okay, that's it there. So if you look at age, it's a numeric variable here. So we will convert the age to a categorical variable by categorizing age into 3 categories. We'll have young, adults, middle age, and older people. So that's what we will do. So that's what we're doing here with this first code. We're categorizing the numerical age into young adults, middle age, and older adults. Okay. So if we run that, it will categorize. So you can see we now have age group, which has been categorized into young adults, middle age, and older adults. Okay. So now we have a categorical variable, and we'll now use this categorical variable to fit into the model to look at the relationship between age group and diabetes. Okay. So, but first of all, let's just look at a visualization to see what that relationship looks like. Okay. So if we visualize it, this is what it actually looks like. So the green part is the non-diabetic people, and the pink part is the diabetic people, right? So for young adults, you can see that there are more non-diabetics than diabetic, whereas as age increases, that relationship becomes more. There are more people with diabetes in the older age group than in the younger age group. Okay. Now let us fit the logistic regression model to see how that pans out. So again, we're going to use our generalized linear model function. And then the formula here is diabetes versus age group. Now, age group is a categorical variable. The data is our age data, which we just created up there. And then the family is still our binomial, which models logistic regression for a binary outcome. So if I run that, again, it chunks out some values for us. Now, again, this is the code that produced that outcome. We have our coefficients, and again, the two most important ones for us are the estimate and the p-value. Now, this first intercept here actually represents the baseline group. In our own case here, the baseline group is the young adults. So we're comparing other groups to these young adults, right? And that is why if you look at the other rows, you can only see middle-aged and older adults. We don't have young adults here because young adults are the comparison group, right? So if you look at the value of the middle age, the estimate here is 1.31. So what this means is that middle-aged people have a 1.31 chance or 1.31 chance of having diabetes than the young people, or are 1.31 times more likely to have diabetes than the younger adults. Again, for the older adults, which is this row, this 1.186 is telling us that older adults have a 1.18 higher chance of having diabetes when compared with the baseline group, which is the young adults. And then the p-value for each of them, which is far less than 0.05, is telling us that these estimates that we have are highly statistically significant in both cases. Okay. So the next one we're going to do, now we have seen how age group, which is a categorical variable, how it models with diabetes, and we have seen how glucose, which is a continuous variable, models with diabetes. Now we will see that in this third case, we can begin to add more experimental variables together, and that is the power of logistic regression. You can model more explanatory variables, multiple of them within one model, to see how each of them contributes to the probability of having the variable of the outcome variable or the variable of interest, right? So in this case, we're going to see how both age and glucose affect your chances of having diabetes. Again, the formula is still the same thing we've been doing. You're using your generalized linear model to do that. The only difference now is in the formula, whereas diabetes is the outcome variable, we're modeling it against two explanatory variables. So we're going to add, so use the plus to add both of the explanatory variables. So glucose plus age, right? Now, every other thing remains the same. Your data is still the Pima Indians diabetes and the family is still binomial. So when we run this, this is what we find. So in this case, you can see the code that produced that outcome, and then we have our coefficients. You can see right now we have both glucose and age now in the model. So again, the value of the estimate here for glucose is 0.03. And that means for each unit rise in glucose, there is a 0.035 chance of having diabetes. Whereas for age, for each 1 year rise in age, there is a 0.02 chance of having diabetes. And if you look at the p-values, both p-values are highly statistically significant. Okay. So let's move on. So now let us look at some of the all of those questions that we saw. So we have looked at the estimates, the p-value. There are other things here like the AIC, the residual deviance. So let us look at some of them and see what those denote. So I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation and we'll see. Okay, so we mentioned something about the reference category when we were talking about the the coefficients. So the reference category, so under the heading of the coefficient, there is no row for young adults. When we did the one of age groups versus diabetes, we saw that the young adults row wasn't represented, but we saw intercept. And this is because the young adult is the reference category and is used as the baseline comparison for that. So usually the first row in the outcome of a logistic regression is usually the baseline. So each of the other age categories will be compared to this baseline, which is young adult category, to determine if there is a change in the chances of being diagnosed diabetes when we move from young adult to that category. Okay. Then again, the coefficients. So the intercept. So when looking at the example of the glucose, when we did the model of the glucose versus diabetes, we decided to ignore the intercept because it represented the likelihood of diabetes when glucose is 0, which is meaningless because glucose is never 0 in anyone. So in the case of the categorical variable, however, the intercept is the likelihood of diabetes for the reference category. So we need to appreciate the difference of the intercept when we're dealing with a numerical variable and a categorical variable, okay? In this case, it is negative. So being a young adult decreases the chance of being diagnosed with diabetes. Okay, the AIC, which is a metric for comparing models, balancing goodness of fit with model complexity. A lower AIC value suggests a better trade-off between fit and complexity. And adding variables that improve the model without overfitting typically results in a lower AIC value. If we notice, when we run the model for the glucose-only model, it gave us an AIC of 814.59. However, when we included age to that model, the AIC reduced to 803. And this kind of tells us, or is indicating that adding age to a model improves the overall fit of that model. So those are one of the things we consider with logistic regression. Another parameter is the residual deviance. So this residual deviance, it measures how well the model fits the data. It's actually a summary of the discrepancies between observed outcomes and the model predictions. Lower values, again, indicate a better fit. A drop in the residual deviance when adding a variable suggests that a new variable improves the model. Again, we saw that when we had just the glucose-only model, our residual deviance was 808. Whereas when age was added to the model, it reduced to 797.36, showing that it's an improved fit with the addition of age. Now, there are some concepts that we need to also look at when we're talking about logistic regression. One of them is confounding. Confounding occurs when a third variable influences both the predictor and the outcome, distorting the apparent relationship between the predictor and the outcome. Confounding creates a spurious association that might disappear or change when the confounding variable is controlled for by including it in the model. A notorious example of this is usually the relationship between alcohol and lung cancer, which is usually an example given in most epidemiological textbooks. So when you look at people that have that drink a lot, you see that there is a correlation between alcohol drinking and lung cancer. However, there's an underlying variable, which is smoking, which is the confounding factor in that relationship. Because it seems that people that smoke also drink, I mean, most likely also drink, and then smoking is also related to lung cancer. So smoking is the confounding factor in the relationship between alcohol and lung cancer. So using the model that the data set that we used in this case, and so in this model example, we should ask if being older has an effect on both the likelihood of diabetes, which is the outcome variable, as well as glucose levels, which is the explanatory variables. If that were true, then some of the effect of glucose on diabetes could be accounted for simply by virtue of the fact that older people have higher glucose levels and older people are more likely to have diabetes. So if we look at the values on the right, the first one on top shows us the estimate from the logistic regression when we use only glucose as the model. Whereas when we use both glucose and age, you can see that the estimate for glucose is slightly reduced from 0.37 in the glucose only model to 0.35 in the glucose and age model, to show us that there is some confounding that happened there between age, glucose, and diabetes. Okay. Another parameter we need to look at is what we call effect modifiers or interacting variables. These are slightly different from confounders. So if we stick with the example of glucose and age, while it is true that older people have higher glucose, it might also be true that being older due to changes in your physiology with age modifies the effect of glucose on diabetes risk. So not only do older people have higher levels of glucose, but the glucose itself has a different effect on diabetes as one gets older. So we're going to look at this effect as we repeat the model to look at the effect of the effect modifier. So if we look at the codes on the screen, the code on top looks at the effect as a confounding effect. So we see glucose plus age. Whereas when you're looking at it in terms of modifying effect, it is glucose times age. You can see the clear difference in those codes between the top and the bottom. One is plus age, one is times age. So the one of times age helps us to identify a modifying effect when we do that. And so when we run this, you can see that when you have the plus age confounding effect, you can see the estimate is 0.35 for glucose and 0.027 for age. However, when we look at the interaction in terms of the modifying effect, you can see the values have been altered, and we can see there is an interaction between glucose and age. The last row shows us that, which shows us it's kind of a negative interaction. And we can explain that to say that for those with higher glucose levels, as the age increases, for those with higher glucose levels, the increase in age negatively affects that diabetes. Whereas for those with a higher age, increasing glucose kind of has a reverse effect on diabetes. Okay, another parameter is our collinearities. Collinearity in logistic regression happens when two or more predictor variables are highly correlated with each other, as having a very high correlation coefficient. It can lead to unstable estimates, inflated standard errors, and difficulty in interpreting the unique contributions of each of these predictors. Collinearity makes it difficult for the model to figure out the individual impact of each variable on the outcome because they're essentially explaining the same variance. Okay, so there are ways we can kind of mitigate or deal with collinearity in our data. Some of them are outlined here, including removing one of the collinear variables, combining variables, stepwise regression, etc., etc. So these are some of the ways we can deal with collinearity in our model. And then when you're doing logistic regression, there are some assumptions that you will have to factor in. One of them is that the dependent variable or the outcome variable usually has to be a binary one, just like we saw in our example, diabetes or no diabetes. So it has to be a binary one. And then the observations have to be independent. What do I mean here? It means that the observations should not be related to one another. I'll give you an example of a dependent observation. So if you take, let's say you do you take glucose samples from a patient before and after an intervention, but you're taking it from the same group of people. So there is likelihood that the before values are dependent on the after values because they are from the same individuals. So those kind of assumptions need to be considered when you're doing a logistic regression to make sure that the observations are not dependent, they are independent. And then you have to make sure that your sample size is adequate. There's usually a rule of thumb to have 10 observations per predictor. No omitted variables that bias the study. So we need to ensure that we include as much variables in the study that will help us have a very good model. And then we need to use a good logistic regression model fit. And then we should have no perfect multicollinearity, just like we just saw. And then there should be a linear relationship between the log odds and the predictors. And also we should have absence of highly influential outliers within our data set.